While I'm getting ready today and starting with my primer, I want to tell you about a man who looked like someone you would trust instantly. He was handsome, educated, and charming. He volunteered in political campaigns, attended college, and could hold a conversation with almost anyone. To strangers, he seemed polite. To friends, he seemed intelligent. To many women, he appeared safe. But behind that carefully crafted image was one of the most dangerous serial killers America has ever known. A man whose crimes would terrify the country and forever change the way investigators looked at serial murder. What's especially disturbing about this story is that Ted Bundy didn't fit the image people expected. When most of us think about violent criminals, we imagine someone suspicious or obviously dangerous. Bundy was neither. He looked ordinary. In fact, many people considered him attractive. That was exactly what made him so terrifying. He understood human psychology. He knew how trust worked. And he knew how to use it against people. As I blend my foundation, imagine living in America during the early 1970s. College campuses were filled with students excited about their futures. Young women attended classes, spent weekends with friends, and planned careers and families. It felt like a time of opportunity. Nobody knew that a predator was moving quietly through those same communities. Nobody realized that disappearances occurring miles apart might be connected. At first, each case seemed isolated. But investigators were about to discover a pattern so horrifying that it would shock the nation. Ted Bundy was born in 1946. His early life was surrounded by uncertainty and family secrets. For years, he grew up believing that his mother was actually his sister. The truth about his family background remained hidden from him during important years of childhood. Later, psychologists would debate whether those experiences affected him emotionally. No one can say for certain what created the darkness inside him. But what is clear is that by adulthood, Bundy had become extremely skilled at presenting a version of himself that other people wanted to believe. As I move on to concealer, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Nearly everyone who met Ted Bundy described him positively. He wasn't known for violent outbursts. He wasn't constantly getting into trouble. Instead, he seemed ambitious. He studied psychology. He became involved in politics. He worked jobs that allowed him to interact with people. From the outside, his life appeared normal. Yet beneath the surface, investigators would later uncover fantasies and behaviors that revealed a far darker reality. By 1974, something strange was happening in Washington state. Young women were disappearing. Some vanished after leaving classes. Others disappeared while running errands or spending time in public places. Families reported them missing, expecting that they would return home. But many never did. The disappearances left communities frightened and confused. There were few witnesses, very little evidence, and almost no understanding of who could be responsible. One of the first cases that captured attention involved a young woman named Karen Sparks. She survived a brutal attack but suffered devastating injuries. The crime shocked investigators. Yet at the time, nobody realized that it might be connected to something much larger. Looking back, many experts now see this attack as an early warning sign of the violence that would follow. While I'm applying a light layer of setting powder, imagine being one of the detectives assigned to these cases. You have missing women, limited evidence, and growing public fear. Every lead seems to disappear. Every clue raises more questions. The victims appear to have no obvious connection. Different backgrounds. Different lifestyles. Different locations. Yet something felt wrong. Something suggested these crimes might be linked. Then witnesses began describing a strange man. Several women reported encountering someone who appeared injured. Sometimes he wore a sling. Other times he pretended to have trouble carrying books or packages. He would politely ask for help. Because he seemed harmless, many women felt comfortable assisting him. It was a simple trick. But investigators would eventually realize it was one of Bundy's favorite methods. Think about how effective that approach was. Most people want to help someone who appears injured. Most people don't expect danger from a polite stranger asking for assistance. Bundy understood this. He used social expectations against his victims. Instead of forcing trust, he earned it. At least long enough to get someone close. As I begin working on my eyebrows, another disappearance sent shockwaves through the region. Young women continued vanishing under mysterious circumstances. Families pleaded for information. Friends organized searches. Posters appeared across communities. Yet despite growing concern, investigators still lacked the evidence needed to identify a suspect. The fear continued spreading because nobody knew who might disappear next. Then came Lake Sammamish. On a warm summer day in July 1974, thousands of people gathered at the popular recreation area. Families swam. Friends relaxed in the sun. Children played near the water. It seemed like the safest place imaginable. Yet hidden among the crowd was a man preparing to hunt in plain sight. Witnesses later recalled meeting a friendly young man named Ted. He wore a sling and approached women asking for help loading a sailboat. Nothing about the interaction appeared unusual. He seemed polite and well-spoken. Some women agreed to help. Others declined and thought nothing more about it. But 2 women who encountered him that day would never return home. When investigators learned that multiple witnesses had heard the same name, they became increasingly interested. Ted. Such a common name seemed almost useless as evidence. Yet it was one of the first significant clues in the entire investigation. As I start applying bronzer, imagine the frustration detectives felt. They finally had a possible lead. A name. A description. A pattern. But they still didn't know who Ted was. Thousands of men matched that description. The investigation remained stuck. Then something unexpected happened. Reports from different locations began showing similarities. Missing women shared physical characteristics. Many had long hair parted in the middle. Several were college students. Investigators started considering the possibility that one offender might be targeting a specific type of victim. The idea was terrifying. Because if a serial predator was responsible, it meant the crimes were unlikely to stop on their own. And what investigators would discover next would make the situation even more alarming. At the very moment law enforcement was struggling to identify a suspect, Ted Bundy was becoming more confident. Each successful crime reduced his fear of getting caught. Each escape encouraged him to take greater risks. The predator who had once operated cautiously was beginning to believe he was smarter than everyone searching for him. That confidence would eventually become his greatest weakness. But before investigators could expose him, even more women would disappear. And the next clue would bring detectives closer to the truth than ever before. As I start blending my bronzer, investigators across Washington were facing a nightmare. Every new disappearance added pressure. Families wanted answers. Communities wanted reassurance. But detectives still didn't have a suspect they could confidently identify. They had witness statements. They had theories. They had a first name. Yet they remained one step behind the men responsible. What nobody realized was that Ted Bundy wasn't simply committing crimes. He was studying people. He paid attention to how others reacted. He observed law enforcement. He learned from mistakes. Every successful abduction increased his confidence and made him believe he could continue operating without consequences. Around this time, investigators began receiving reports that seemed impossible to ignore. Witnesses consistently described a tall, attractive young man with a cast or sling. Several women remembered being approached by someone asking for help carrying items to a vehicle. The details were strikingly similar. Yet despite these similarities, proving a connection remained incredibly difficult. As I move on to contour, imagine how frightening this was for young women living in the area. News reports discussed disappearances almost constantly. Parents worried when daughters left home. Friends began walking together whenever possible. College campuses became filled with rumors. Some stories were exaggerated. Others were completely false. But one thing was certain. Fear was spreading. And then investigators made an important discovery. A witness came forward with information about a vehicle. Several women had mentioned seeing a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle. At first, it seemed like a small detail. But detectives knew that small details often solved major cases. They began collecting information about Volkswagen owners who matched witness descriptions. Thousands of names had to be reviewed. Thousands of possibilities had to be considered. It was exhausting work. Yet hidden somewhere in those records was the man they were desperately trying to find. Meanwhile, Ted Bundy continued living what appeared to be a normal life. He attended classes. He socialized. He maintained relationships. He presented himself as an ordinary young man with a promising future. That double life remains one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. Many serial offenders appear isolated or suspicious. Bundy often appeared exactly the opposite. He could discuss politics one moment and commit horrific acts the next. As I apply concealer beneath my eyes, there's another detail that makes this story especially chilling. Some people close to Bundy actually suspected him. Not because they had proof. Not because they witnessed crimes. But because certain details felt unsettling. One of those people was his girlfriend. Over time, she noticed similarities between media reports and Bundy's appearance. She noticed similarities between descriptions of the suspect and things she knew about him. Eventually, concern pushed her to contact authorities. Imagine how difficult that must have been. You're worried that someone you care about could be connected to terrible crimes. You don't want to believe it. You hope you're wrong. Yet the suspicion refuses to disappear. She provided information to investigators. Unfortunately, at that stage, detectives had thousands of potential leads. Bundy's name entered the system. But it didn't receive immediate attention. Looking back, many investigators later admitted that this was a missed opportunity. But at the time, there simply wasn't enough evidence. And Bundy knew how to appear trustworthy. As I start applying blush, the investigation suddenly expanded beyond Washington. New disappearances were occurring in neighboring states. The pattern seemed to be growing. The fear was spreading. Authorities began sharing information across jurisdictions. Detectives who had never worked together before were now exchanging reports and comparing evidence. Slowly, a larger picture started emerging. But this is where the story becomes truly disturbing. The crimes were escalating. The offender was becoming bolder. And investigators still had no idea how many victims there might be. Every new case raised the same question. How long had this been happening? And how many families had already been affected? As I begin working on my eyeshadow, imagine being a detective reviewing case files late at night. Photographs. Witness statements. Maps. Timelines. Missing persons reports. Hours turn into days. Days turn into weeks. Yet the answers remain frustratingly out of reach. Then another breakthrough arrived. Witnesses continued mentioning the name Ted. That single detail kept appearing. Again and again. Different locations. Different victims. Different witnesses. Same name. Same general description. The consistency was becoming impossible to ignore. For the first time, investigators felt they might be closing in. But Ted Bundy wasn't standing still. He had already begun moving. As pressure increased in Washington, Bundy relocated to Utah. To him, it was a fresh start. A new environment. New potential victims. And perhaps most importantly, a chance to stay ahead of investigators. What authorities didn't realize was that the nightmare was following him. The disappearances soon continued. Young women began vanishing in Utah under circumstances that felt disturbingly familiar. Again there were few witnesses. Again there was little evidence. Again families were left searching for answers. The similarities were impossible to overlook. As I deepened the outer corners of my eyeshadow, the emotional toll on families became devastating. Parents spent nights waiting for phone calls that never came. Friends organized searches. Communities gathered for vigils. Hope slowly transformed into fear. And fear slowly transformed into grief. For many families, the uncertainty was almost unbearable. Not knowing what happened can sometimes feel worse than knowing. Questions remain unanswered. Possibilities remain open. Every passing day becomes its own kind of suffering. Meanwhile, Bundy continued appearing calm. Normal. Controlled. The contrast between his public image and private actions shocked investigators once the full truth emerged. People who knew him struggled to reconcile the two versions of the same person. How could someone seem so ordinary while hiding such darkness? It's a question that still fascinates psychologists today. As I apply eyeliner, investigators finally caught a break. In August 1975, a police officer noticed a suspicious vehicle. The driver was Ted Bundy. Initially, the stop seemed routine. But when officers searched the car, they discovered items that raised serious concerns. There were objects that could potentially be used in crimes. Nothing immediately proved murder. Nothing instantly solved the case. But investigators suddenly had something they had lacked before. They had Ted Bundy in custody. For the first time, the man who had spent years staying ahead of authorities found himself under intense scrutiny. And what detectives uncovered next would begin unraveling the carefully constructed image he had spent years creating. As I finish my eyeliner and prepare for mascara, Bundy remained calm during questioning. He denied wrongdoing. He explained away suspicious evidence. He projected confidence. Many offenders become visibly nervous during investigations. Bundy often appeared composed. Almost detached. That confidence impressed some people. But it also frustrated investigators. Because behind every answer seemed to be another question. Behind every explanation seemed to be another contradiction. And detectives were determined to keep digging. What they didn't yet realize was that they were only beginning to uncover the truth. The deeper they looked into Ted Bundy's past, the darker the picture became. Connections started appearing. Witnesses started identifying him. Evidence started aligning. The pieces of the puzzle were finally moving into place. But the most shocking revelations were still ahead. Because once investigators began connecting cases across multiple states, they would discover a trail of destruction far larger than anyone had imagined. And the next witness identification would bring them dangerously close to exposing one of America's most notorious serial killers. As I start applying mascara, investigators finally felt something they hadn't experienced in a long time. Momentum. For months, and in some cases years, they had been chasing fragments of information. A witness statement here. A suspicious report there. Nothing seemed strong enough to build a complete picture. But now, for the first time, multiple pieces of evidence were beginning to point toward the same man. Ted Bundy. Even then, proving it wouldn't be easy. Bundy was intelligent. He understood how investigations worked. He knew how to answer questions without revealing too much. And perhaps most importantly, he understood how people perceived him. That charm had protected him for years. Now investigators had to find a way around it. As I carefully apply my second coat of mascara, imagine sitting across from Ted Bundy in an interview room. You expect a monster. Instead, you see someone calm and articulate. Someone who smiles. Someone who speaks confidently. Someone who appears cooperative. That disconnect became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Because the person sitting in front of investigators looked nothing like the men described in crime reports. And yet evidence continued leading back to him. The deeper detectives dug, the more concerning the similarities became. Witness descriptions matched. Vehicle descriptions matched. Timelines matched. Locations matched. Slowly but steadily, the walls were beginning to close in. But this is where the story takes another disturbing turn. Even while under investigation, Bundy still believed he could outsmart the system. And for a period of time, it seemed like he might succeed. As I move on to my lower lash line, investigators focused heavily on one victim whose case would become critically important. That victim was a young woman named Carol Durant. Unlike many others, Carol survived. Her testimony would become one of the strongest pieces of evidence against Bundy. The encounter began when a man approached her in a shopping center parking lot. He identified himself as a police officer. He appeared professional, calm, trustworthy. He informed her that someone had attempted to break into her vehicle. Naturally, Carol was concerned. The men suggested they go together to discuss the situation further. At first, everything seemed believable. But then something felt wrong. Very wrong. As I begin blending a transition shade into my crease, imagine the fear building in that moment. You're alone. You're with someone claiming authority. You want to trust them. Yet your instincts are telling you something isn't right. Carol later described growing increasingly suspicious. And then the situation suddenly escalated. The men attempted to restrain her. A violent struggle followed. But unlike many victims, Carol fought back. She escaped. She survived. And most importantly, she remembered his face. That detail would become crucial. Because survivors can provide something investigators desperately need. Identification. Evidence. A direct connection. When Carol later identified Ted Bundy, detectives paid very close attention. For the first time, they had a witness capable of placing him directly at the center of a violent crime. And what happened next changed everything. As I apply a shimmer shade to the center of my eyelids, Bundy was formally charged. The legal process began moving forward. News coverage increased dramatically. People across the country started hearing his name. Yet even then, many struggled to believe the allegations. Friends couldn't reconcile the accusations with the person they thought they knew. Some defended him. Others questioned the investigation. And that reaction highlights something important. People often assume danger looks obvious. But real life is rarely that simple. The most dangerous individuals sometimes hide behind ordinary appearances. And Ted Bundy understood that better than almost anyone. As his case moved through the courts, investigators continued connecting additional evidence. The picture becoming visible was horrifying. Multiple states. Multiple disappearances. Multiple victims. What initially appeared to be isolated crimes now seemed connected to a single offender. And authorities feared the true number of victims might be far higher than anyone realized. As I start applying highlighter, another shocking development occurred. Ted Bundy decided to represent himself in court. Think about that for a moment. Most defendants rely heavily on attorneys. Bundy believed he could perform better himself. It reflected an extraordinary level of confidence. Some would call it arrogance. Others would call it narcissism. Either way, it demonstrated how strongly he believed in his ability to manipulate situations. And unfortunately, that confidence would soon create a serious problem. Because Bundy wasn't just planning legal arguments. He was planning something else. Something investigators never expected. As I lightly highlight the inner corners of my eyes, the courtroom became the setting for one of the most unbelievable moments in true crime history. Bundy escaped. Not once, but twice. The first escape stunned authorities. While reviewing documents in a courthouse library, he jumped from a window and fled. For days, law enforcement searched desperately. The story dominated headlines. Communities worried. Families of victims felt devastated. How could a suspected serial killer simply disappear? Fortunately, he was eventually recaptured. But instead of learning from the experience, authorities would soon face an even bigger disaster. Because Bundy wasn't finished. And his second escape would have far more tragic consequences. As I blend my highlighter, imagine what was happening inside Bundy's mind. He had escaped once. He had experienced the thrill of freedom. He believed he could do it again. Over time, he carefully studied weaknesses in the jail. He observed routines. He identified opportunities. And then he acted. One night, Bundy escaped again. This time, he vanished completely. By the time authorities realized what happened, he had already traveled hundreds of miles. The man investigators believed responsible for numerous violent crimes was free. And what happened during the weeks that followed would become some of the darkest chapters in the entire case. As I began setting my makeup with spray, Bundy arrived in Florida. For a brief period, he successfully avoided detection. He rented a room, moved around freely, and once again blended into everyday life. To strangers, he appeared normal, ordinary, forgettable. But beneath that appearance, violence was escalating. The pressure of being hunted had not changed him. If anything, it had made him even more dangerous. And investigators had no idea how quickly events were about to spiral out of control. Then came one of the most infamous incidents associated with Ted Bundy. The attack at the Chi Omega sorority house. The crime shocked the nation. The brutality stunned investigators. And the scale of violence left communities horrified. For many Americans following the case, this was the moment they truly understood the danger Bundy represented. Yet even after these attacks, authorities still faced one major challenge: finding him. Because once again, Bundy had disappeared. And every day he remained free increased the possibility of more victims. As I finish setting my makeup and take a step back to look at the overall look, investigators across multiple states were working together more intensely than ever before. Tips poured in. Witnesses came forward. Leads were pursued around the clock. The search expanded. Pressure intensified. And somewhere in Florida, Ted Bundy was making decisions that would ultimately lead to his downfall. What investigators didn't know yet was that a small mistake was about to destroy the illusion of control he had maintained for years. The predator who believed he could outsmart everyone was about to leave behind evidence he couldn't explain away. And when that evidence emerged, the truth would become impossible to ignore. Because the next breakthrough wouldn't just identify Ted Bundy as a suspect. It would help transform suspicion into certainty. And once that happened, the carefully crafted mask he had worn for so many years would begin to collapse. As I began applying lip liner, investigators in Florida were racing against time. Ted Bundy had already demonstrated something terrifying. He could disappear. He could reinvent himself. And he could continue moving before authorities caught up. Every day he remained free created another opportunity for violence. The pressure on law enforcement was enormous. News stations covered the search constantly. Communities remained on edge. Parents worried about daughters leaving home alone. College campuses felt different. People looked over their shoulders more often. Trust was becoming harder to give. And yet the man responsible was still walking free. What nobody realized was that Bundy was about to make a mistake he couldn't undo. A mistake that would eventually help investigators build one of the strongest cases against him. As I carefully shape my lips, let's talk about something that would become critically important. Forensic evidence. Today we often think about DNA evidence solving cases. But in the 1970s, investigators relied on different tools. One of the most powerful involved dental impressions. At first glance, that might not sound particularly significant. But what happened next would prove otherwise. Because during one of Bundy's attacks, investigators discovered evidence that would later become central to the case against him. And once experts analyzed it, the results would send shockwaves through the courtroom. As I apply my lipstick, Bundy's life as a fugitive was becoming increasingly unstable. Running requires constant adjustment. New locations. New identities. New risks. Maintaining control becomes harder and harder. The confidence that once helped him avoid detection was slowly turning into recklessness. And reckless criminals make mistakes. Eventually, those mistakes attract attention. That's exactly what happened in February 1978. A police officer noticed suspicious behavior involving a vehicle. Initially, the stop seemed routine. Nothing extraordinary. Just another interaction between law enforcement and a driver. But as officers investigated further, they discovered the driver was Ted Bundy. After years of violence, after multiple states, after countless hours of investigation, after 2 dramatic escapes, Ted Bundy was finally back in custody. And this time, he wasn't getting away. As I begin cleaning up the edges of my lipstick, imagine the emotions investigators must have felt. Relief. Satisfaction. Exhaustion. For years, this man had remained one step ahead. For years, families had waited for answers. Now authorities finally had another chance to hold him accountable. But arresting Bundy was only the beginning. The real challenge involved proving his crimes in court. And that would require evidence strong enough to overcome his charm, intelligence, and ability to manipulate situations. As I add the finishing touches to my makeup, prosecutors started assembling their case. Witness testimony. Physical evidence. Timelines. Photographs. Forensic analysis. Every piece mattered. Every detail counted. Because they understood something important. Ted Bundy wasn't going to confess. At least not yet. He intended to fight. He intended to challenge evidence. He intended to convince jurors that investigators had made mistakes. And for a time, some people still believed him. That fact remains difficult to understand for many observers today. But it demonstrates how powerful appearances can be. People wanted to believe someone so intelligent and charismatic couldn't possibly be responsible for such horrific crimes. The evidence, however, told a different story. And that evidence was about to become impossible to ignore. As I step back and admire the final makeup look, let's talk about one of the most dramatic moments of the trial. The bite mark evidence. Experts compared impressions from Bundy's teeth to marks associated with one of the crime scenes. The analysis became a major focus. When jurors saw the comparisons, prosecutors argued that the similarities were overwhelming. Defense teams challenged the conclusions. Debates followed. But for many people watching the trial, the evidence felt devastating. And it wasn't the only thing working against Bundy. Witnesses had identified him. Survivors had described him. Investigators had connected him to key locations. The case was growing stronger. The walls were closing in. And Bundy knew it. As the trial continued, another disturbing reality became clear. Ted Bundy appeared to enjoy the attention. Television cameras followed every development. Reporters documented every statement. Crowds gathered to watch proceedings. In many ways, Bundy became one of the first modern criminal celebrities. That phenomenon created controversy. Some observers worried that media coverage focused too heavily on Bundy's appearance and personality rather than the victims whose lives had been destroyed. It's an important criticism. Because at the center of this story are real people. Young women with dreams. Families. Friends. Future plans. Lives that mattered. And those lives should never be overshadowed by the men who took them. As public interest intensified, emotional testimony filled the courtroom. Families described their grief. Friends remembered victims. Investigators recounted years of searching for answers. The human cost became impossible to ignore. Every victim represented a future stolen. Every family represented a wound that would never fully heal. And for many people listening, the emotional impact was overwhelming. But this is where the story becomes even darker. Because despite mounting evidence, Bundy still attempted to maintain control. He continued presenting himself as confident, composed, unbothered. Yet beneath that appearance, reality was changing. The strategy that had protected him for years was no longer working. People weren't seeing a misunderstood young man. They were seeing a predator. And that shift would prove impossible to reverse. As investigators continued uncovering information, a clearer picture of Bundy's methods emerged. He often targeted trust. He exploited kindness. He used deception instead of immediate force. That approach allowed him to get close to victims without attracting attention. Understanding those tactics became important for law enforcement. Because Bundy's crimes demonstrated how manipulation can be just as dangerous as physical violence. The lessons learned from these investigations would influence future criminal profiling efforts for decades. As the prosecution presented more evidence, many observers began asking a question. Why? Why would someone with intelligence, opportunities, and social skills choose such a path? What drives a person toward such extreme violence? Psychologists attempted to answer those questions. Experts analyzed his childhood, his relationships, his behavior, his personality traits. Yet even today, there is no simple explanation. Human behavior is complex. Evil rarely has a single cause. And Ted Bundy remains one of the most studied criminal minds in modern history. As the trial approached its conclusion, tension filled the courtroom. Jurors faced enormous responsibility. Families waited anxiously. Investigators reflected on years of work. Everyone understood the significance of what was about to happen. Because the verdict wouldn't just determine Bundy's future. It would represent a moment of accountability for countless victims and families. And when that verdict finally arrived, it marked the beginning of the end for one of America's most notorious serial killers. But even then, shocking revelations were still waiting to emerge. Because after conviction came something investigators had sought for years. The truth. And when Bundy finally began discussing aspects of his crimes, the full scale of the horror became even more disturbing than many had imagined. The next chapter would reveal secrets that had remained hidden for years. And those revelations would forever change how America remembered the name Ted Bundy. As I reach for a gloss to finish the look, we're entering the part of this story that many investigators, journalists, and families spent years waiting for. The truth. Or at least as much of the truth as Ted Bundy was willing to reveal. For years, Bundy denied responsibility. For years, he insisted investigators were wrong. For years, he projected confidence, even after conviction. But eventually, something changed. The reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. His appeals were running out. His options were disappearing. And suddenly, the men who had spent years hiding information began talking. Not because he wanted to help families. Not because he felt remorse. But because information had become valuable. And what he revealed would shock even experienced investigators. As I gently apply lip gloss, imagine sitting across from a man suspected of dozens of murders. You don't know whether he's telling the truth. You don't know whether he's exaggerating. You don't know whether he's manipulating you. Yet every word could potentially help solve cases that have haunted families for years. That's exactly the challenge investigators faced. Bundy remained difficult to trust. Even when confessing. Even when providing details. Even when discussing victims. The possibility of manipulation was always present. And that uncertainty continues to surround many aspects of the case today. As reporters followed every development, Bundy started discussing crimes that had remained unsolved. He described locations, methods, timelines, victims. Some information matched evidence only investigators would have known. Other details helped authorities locate remains connected to missing persons cases. With every revelation, the scale of the tragedy became clearer. What once seemed horrifying now appeared even worse. Because investigators were no longer looking at isolated crimes. They were examining years of violence spanning multiple states. And the numbers continued growing. As I press my lips together and check the final result, one reality became impossible to escape. There were far more victims than most people initially realized. Some families finally received answers after years of uncertainty. Others learned details they wished they never had to hear. The emotional impact was devastating. Imagine spending years wondering what happened to someone you love. Then suddenly receiving confirmation. Not hope. Not possibilities. Confirmation. For many families, the truth brought closure. But closure does not erase pain. Closure does not restore lost time. Closure does not bring someone back. It simply ends the uncertainty. And sometimes even that comes at an enormous emotional cost. As investigators continued questioning Bundy, another disturbing pattern emerged. He often spoke about victims in detached ways. Clinical ways. As though discussing events rather than human beings. That emotional distance fascinated psychologists. How could someone appear so disconnected from suffering? How could someone understand what happened and still show so little genuine empathy? Those questions remain part of the reason this case continues being studied decades later. Because Ted Bundy wasn't simply a criminal. He became a case study in manipulation, narcissism, violence, and deception. And the more experts learned, the more disturbing the picture became. As I smoothed down my hair and prepared to finish getting ready, let's talk about one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding this case. Many people assume evil is easy to identify. They assume dangerous individuals stand out. They assume warning signs are always obvious. Bundy challenged those assumptions. He looked normal. He sounded normal. He often behaved normally. That's precisely why he was so dangerous. The image he presented to the world acted like camouflage. And that camouflage allowed him to move through society without attracting immediate suspicion. For investigators, the lesson was profound. Appearances alone mean very little. Actions matter. Patterns matter. Behavior matters. And those lessons continue influencing criminal investigations today. As media coverage expanded, psychologists and criminologists began analyzing every aspect of Bundy's life. His childhood. His relationships. His motivations. His personality. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted explanations. But some questions remain frustratingly difficult. Human behavior rarely fits into neat categories. There isn't always one event that creates a violent offender. There isn't always one explanation that makes everything make sense. Sometimes the truth is more uncomfortable. Sometimes multiple factors combine in ways we still don't fully understand. And Ted Bundy remains one of the most debated examples of that reality. As years passed, interviews with investigators revealed something surprising. Many of them remembered feeling disturbed not only by Bundy's crimes, but by how ordinary he could seem during conversations. He could discuss everyday topics. He could joke. He could appear calm. Then moments later, discussions would shift toward horrifying crimes. That contrast left lasting impressions on people who encountered him. Because it challenged basic assumptions about human nature. It forced people to confront a difficult truth. Monsters do not always look monstrous. Sometimes they look exactly like everyone else. As I gather my makeup products and begin putting them away, let's focus on the victims for a moment. Because their stories matter. Far too often, public attention becomes focused entirely on offenders. Yet behind every case are people whose futures were stolen. Young women with goals. Dreams. Families. Friendships. Careers they never had the chance to pursue. Lives that deserved far more time. Their loss created ripples that extended through entire communities. Parents lost daughters. Siblings lost sisters. Friends lost people they loved. And those effects continue long after headlines disappear. That human cost is the true tragedy of this story. As the legal process finally reached its conclusion, Ted Bundy was sentenced to death. The decision generated enormous public attention. Supporters of capital punishment viewed it as justice. Opponents debated broader ethical questions. Discussions continued for years. But regardless of individual opinions, one thing remained clear. The judicial chapter of Bundy's story was ending. The victims' families, however, would continue carrying the consequences forever. Because court decisions can punish offenders. They cannot erase grief. They cannot restore lost years. And they cannot undo what happened. As his execution date approached, media interest intensified once again. Journalists sought interviews. Experts offered analysis. The public remained fascinated. Some wanted answers. Others wanted understanding. Many simply wanted to know how someone like Ted Bundy could exist. In those final years, Bundy gave additional interviews that continue to be analyzed today. Some observers believed he was finally being honest. Others argued he remained manipulative until the very end. That debate continues. Because separating truth from deception is incredibly difficult when dealing with someone who spent years lying successfully. And perhaps that's one of the final lessons of this case. Manipulation doesn't end simply because someone is caught. It can continue through interviews, through media appearances, through public perception, and understanding that reality remains important. As I take one final look in the mirror, let's reflect on why this story continues capturing attention decades later. It's not simply because of the crimes. It's because the case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know the people around us? How much weight should we place on appearances? Why are some individuals capable of extraordinary cruelty? And how can society better recognize dangerous behavior before tragedy occurs? There are no easy answers. But asking those questions matters. Because every lesson learned has the potential to protect future victims. Every improvement in investigative techniques matters. Every advancement in forensic science matters. Every warning sign recognized matters. And every victim remembered matters. The story of Ted Bundy is not ultimately a story about a serial killer. It's a story about the lives affected by his actions. The families who searched for answers. The investigators who refused to give up. The survivors who found the courage to speak. And the victims whose names deserve to be remembered long after the headlines fade. As I finish getting ready and wrap up today's story, one final thought remains. Some of the most dangerous people in history were not frightening because they looked different. They were frightening because they looked ordinary. And that's a lesson worth remembering. Because awareness begins when we stop judging people solely by appearances and start paying attention to actions. Thank you for getting ready with me today. And thank you for spending this time remembering the people whose stories should never be forgotten.